a March 8, 1945. 21st Bomber Command Headquarters, Guam. Folders packed with targets covered the plotting table like shingles. In the dim light, a cigar ember floated as Major General Curtis LeMay leaned over fresh reconnaissance prints of Tokyo's industrial web. What the images revealed was not a single giant factory district like Detroit or Pittsburgh, but a lattice of small workshops tucked into ordinary streets, lathes and wooden sheds, metal presses behind shop fronts, precision instrument benches set up in converted halls and family homes. A message from the latest recon flight clicked in. Cloud cover minimal, winds favorable, districts confirmed. The note everyone kept scanning for was there too. Densely populated with cottage workshops. LeMay put his coffee down, reached for the operations phone, and set in motion a launch that would span Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. Within hours, 334 B-29 Superfortresses would be airborne. None of the men in those planes could know the scale of what that decision would unleash. The most destructive incendiary campaign humans had ever carried out. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific War had taught the Americans a hard lesson about Japan's production system. It was decentralized by design. Instead of massive unified plants, the country relied on networks of subcontractors embedded in neighborhoods built of wood and paper. Cut enough of those capillaries, and the heart would fail. Numbers from Tokyo told the story plainly. More than half of the capital's war output came from workshops employing fewer than 30 people. Aircraft components were machined in residential wards, electrical systems wired in cramped shops, precision tools assembled in spaces once meant for worship. The Mitsubishi Aircraft Works alone depended on more than 300 suppliers scattered around the metropolis. The supply chain was a city. The B-29 had been created to reach such targets at ranges nobody else could touch. 20 tons empty, 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone radial engines at 2,200 horsepower each, an 11-man crew, and the ability to haul roughly 20,000 pounds of ordnance toward a target 1,500 miles away. It was the most expensive weapons program of the war, a $3.7 billion bet that altitude, speed, and range could reshape strategy. Standing before the mission board, LeMay studied the weather streams flowing across the home islands. He commanded 345 operational superforts spread across the Marianas, the most sophisticated bomber force on Earth, and yet, through February, results in Japan were dismal. The formula that had worked against Germany, high altitude, daylight precision, reliably failed over Japan. The newly discovered jet stream, sometimes pushing past 250 miles per hour at the altitudes the B-29s preferred, scattered bomb patterns miles off target. Hit percentages slid under 5%. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Old's analyses were blunt. Chronic cloud decks, winds aloft that tore formations apart, and defenders who timed interceptions to the exact instant bombers were locked into their runs. Losses approached 6% per mission. The numbers were drifting toward unsustainable. In Washington, pressure mounted. General Henry Hap Arnold had staked his reputation and the future of an independent air arm on B-29s. Members of Congress asked why billions had gone into aircraft that could not crack Japanese industry. The Navy, dominant in the Pacific, argued carrier aviators were delivering real results. The Army's planners pushed forward with invasion timetables, convinced bombardment alone would never force surrender. If the problem was arithmetic, someone had to change the variables. Captain Robert McNamara, a Harvard-trained analyst embedded in the Army Air Force's Office of Statistical Control, studied every data point the crews brought home: sortie tonnage, cost per square mile of production neutralized, target elimination percentages. The statistics implied a grim conclusion. Precision at 30,000 feet over Japan wasn't merely inefficient, it was structurally wrong. To reach the dispersed machine of war, the attack had to change shape. Fire had to replace pinpoint. Across Tokyo, Japanese officers had worried about exactly that possibility since the Doolittle raid in 1942. Staff Officer Giichiro Fujiwara paged through dispersal reports noting how engine parts shifted to Asakusa, electrical assemblies to Fukagawa, ball bearings to Sumida, all threaded into civilian life to defeat a Norden bomb site and a steady bomb run. Dispersal worked against altitude. What it would not stop What the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 had already demonstrated was the catastrophic vulnerability of cities framed in timber. At 1735 on March 9th, the first B-29 lifted off from North Field, Guam, and the nature of the air war pivoted. This time, guns and armor came off, everything except the tail guns. Ammunition drums were pulled, plates that once shielded the crew came out. Every pound saved was another pound of incendiaries. Instead of daylight, darkness. Instead of 30,000 feet, 5,000 to 9,000. Instead of general-purpose explosives, stacks of clustered firebombs. The orthodoxy of strategic bombing inverted in a single mission order. Forecasts pointed toward a perfect storm for fire, surface winds around 28 miles per hour to push flames along narrow lanes, low humidity to keep the driest wood hungry, and enough visibility for the pathfinders to see their markers. Each bomber carried roughly 40 clusters of AN-M69 incendiaries. Each cluster contained 38 small bomblets packed with napalm gel. When they burst, temperatures spiked over 2,000 graus a degout, and the burning slurry clung to whatever it touched, consuming oxygen for around 6 minutes, long enough to ignite a building from the inside and spread to the next. 6 tons of incendiaries per aircraft multiplied by 334 aircraft meant roughly 1,665 tons of fire, headed for a city where fire protection remained tragically inadequate. 8,000 firefighters for 7 million people. Only 3 ladder trucks capable of reaching above 2 stories. A patchy pressurized water system, alleys that would trap evacuees, districts built with wooden structures so close you could touch both walls with outstretched hands. Shelters were scarce. Leaders had worried that building them would admit the unthinkable. The Pathfinders reached Tokyo in the first minutes of March 10th, just after 0:08, homing in by radar on an aim point in Shitamachi, the most crowded section of the city. They laid their incendiaries in long, parallel tracks until a great burning X glowed from miles away. That luminous cross became the bullseye for everything following. Bomber streams arrived in procession for nearly 3 hours. By the end, 279 superforts had loosed their loads into the widening furnace. Small household fires fused into a district-wide blaze, and then that blaze fed itself until it became something alive, an area conflagration transitioning to a firestorm. On the ground, temperatures soared past the 800 degree. The air above the inferno rose with such energy that it pulled winds through the streets at near tornado force, stripping oxygen from shelters and driving the flames forward. Pilots flying at 5,000 feet could smell what was happening below. In those conditions, Japanese fighters faded. Anti-aircraft crews abandoned guns as lines burned, pumps ran dry, and the radios failed. Tail gunners said their position wasn't needed. The main threat was the invisible one, thermals tossing a 60-ton bomber skyward like a toy. By 2 in the morning, roughly 16 square miles of Tokyo were aflame. The numbers that came later struggled to capture the scale. 206 deaths and 171 buildings gone, 1,805,000 people without homes. Official deaths put at 83,093, with the real count likely above 100,000. More lives lost in 6 hours than in any single action in history, including the atomic bombings that would come 5 months later. A quarter of the city had disappeared. Factories didn't need plaques to show they had been vital. Their absence rippled through charts. Engine assembly for aircraft in Tokyo, districts fell 75% in a night. Precision tool operations ceased in the areas touched. 12 major suppliers of electronic components were erased. Ball bearing production, an artery for every machine, lost about 40% of national capacity in an instant. When recon flights returned on March 11th, the images replaced crowded grids with ashen plains, punctuated by the occasional concrete shell or a chimney standing like a marker over a vanished firm. Rails curled, steel sagged into shapes with no names. The human shock exceeded any spreadsheet. Thousands of burned and injured overwhelmed clinics with dwindling supplies. Food lines failed as distribution routes collapsed. Waterborne disease followed fire as sanitation broke down. Factories that technically survived could not find workers. The men and women with skills that took years to train were missing or dead. Absenteeism surged for reasons that needed no explanation. Schedules fell apart. The old story, protected by divine winds, insulated by will, melted like glass. Intercepts suggested command in Tokyo felt it too. Navy memoranda admitted coordination was failing. Army procurement officers wrote in plain language about parts that no longer existed. Statistics coming into the munitions ministry registered irreversible loss in the very capacities the war required most. The strategy that had outwitted altitude had no defense against flame, and LeMay was not finished. March 11th brought the next blow. 285 B-29s over Nagoya, the heart of Japanese aircraft manufacture. Mitsubishi's far-flung subcontractors fed a single machine. Fire severed every belt at once. 2 square miles of industrial districts vanished, and aircraft assembly dropped by roughly 40% in a day. On March 13th, 274 Superforts hit Osaka, Japan's second city. About 133 tons of incendiaries fell. The arsenal that produced a fifth of the country's ammunition ceased operation. 8 square miles of commercial and industrial terrain became ash. 134,144 buildings gone. Port infrastructure, responsible for around 30% of imports, burned to the waterline. 3 days later, Kobe endured its turn. 331 B-29s set the 6th largest city ablaze. The Kawasaki yards, builders of a third of Japan's merchant fleet, smoldered for 3 days. Mitsubishi and Kawanishi aircraft plants lost about 60% capacity. 7 square miles depopulated of buildings. Rail and road connections linking western Japan to Tokyo failed in lines and knots of twisted metal. On March 19th, the bombers returned to Nagoya. 290 aircraft focused on what the first strike had left. Aichi's facilities, key to naval attack aircraft, were wiped out across all dispersed sites. Residential zones that housed skilled laborers disappeared. Technical schools that shaped mechanics burned. Another 3 square miles of war production evaporated. When analysts assembled the campaign's first 10 days, March 9th to March 19th, the math was brutal. 373 tons of incendiaries, 42 square miles gone, about 1.5 million people without homes. Output in the core categories fell off a cliff. Aircraft down roughly 68%, munitions by half, machine tools around 72%. The interdependent network that once gave resilience now collapsed in cascade. LeMay was only at the beginning. Alongside the fire fell mines. Operation Starvation, run by the 313th Bombardment Wing, began sowing the waters with Mark 25 mines fitted with magnetic and acoustic triggers that made them stubborn to sweep. 12,000 mines would ultimately close every major port in Japan. Imports, already slashed 90% by submarines, dipped toward zero. Without ore from Manchuria and Korea, steel production stalled. Without bauxite from the south, aluminum starved. Without crude from the Dutch East Indies, the refineries had nothing to crack. Even food shipments faltered, and when bellies empty, machines stop. Through April and into May, the pattern became grimly regular. On April 13th, 327 B-29s returned to Tokyo and erased the Arsenal District. 2 days later, 109 Superforts struck Kawasaki's engine plants. On May 14th, 472 bombers hit Nagoya in the largest daylight incendiary attack of the war. By May 25, cities once considered secondary faced nights like Tokyo's. Yokohama lost about 6.9 square miles in a single raid. 42% of its urban footprint gone. Tokyo burned again. Another 16.8 square miles fell. In the capital that had held 7 million people, half the city now lay in rubble. Together, Tokyo and Yokohama had once produced about 35% of Japan's war material. After those weeks, that figure dropped toward zero. The bodies and the living told parallel stories. Every raid added tens of thousands of casualties. Burn wards overflowed with little to offer but bandages and prayer. Malnutrition crept through neighborhoods like fog. With sanitation systems smashed, disease followed. The men whose hands had tuned gauges and ground bearings died faster than schools could replace them, and many schools were gone too. By August 1945, the unthinkable had become routine. LeMay's target list widened until it included every city with more than 30,000 people. 66 Japanese cities were firebombed. Around 180 square miles of urban ground were turned into moonscape. Roughly 21 million people were displaced. The foundation that had supported a navy once ranked third in the world, and an army of 5 million now resembled a charcoal sketch. Production numbers confirmed collapse. Aircraft assembly peaked at 2,572 planes in September 1944. By July 1945, output had fallen to 1,731. Engine fabrication was down 3/4. Propeller production dropped 80%. Electronic components, vital to every aircraft and ship, were nearly gone. Feedback loops accelerated. Fewer ball bearings meant fewer engines. Fewer engines meant fewer planes. Fewer planes meant almost no defense against bombers that arrived as predictably as the tide. The tallies that closed the campaign were the sort that make historians pause. Total bombs dropped by the B-29 force, about 147,000 tons. Sorties, roughly 15,000. B-29s lost, 414. American aircrew casualties, close to 2,600. Japanese deaths from strategic bombing, somewhere between 400,000 and 600,000, with millions wounded or driven from their homes. Tokyo, in one night, lost more civilians than Britain did over the entire course of the war. Inside Japan's leadership, some voices after the war were stark about the cause of capitulation. Prince Fumimaro Konoe told American interviewers that the sustained B-29 bombing campaign was fundamentally what forced the decision for peace. Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai said much the same, that the superfortress was the single most important factor. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey would later argue that, absent invasion and absent atomic weapons, the combination of conventional bombing and blockade likely would have produced surrender by November 1945. Technology had proved not simply effective, but transformational. The campaign validated strategic bombing as a war-winning instrument. It suggested that a nation's economy, not just its armies, could be attacked directly and decisively from the air. In 1947, an independent air force emerged in the United States, an institutional outcome rooted in those nights over Japan. But the moral ledger never closed quietly. International law in 1945 did not explicitly forbid area bombing of cities. The Hague Conventions emphasized military targets and said little about civilian workers embedded inside their production. Japanese authorities had deliberately intertwined military manufacturing with civilian neighborhoods, complicating discrimination. American planners argued that striking war-sustaining capacity, even when mingled with homes, shortened the war and saved lives on both sides. Critics condemned the raids as indiscriminate, as crimes. LeMay himself offered no apology. "We are at war with Japan. We were attacked by Japan. Do you want to kill Japanese or would you rather have Americans killed?" he asked, making an argument that was bloodless in tone and focused on arithmetic. The planned invasion, Operation Downfall, offered its own set of numbers. The Kyushu landing, Operation Olympic, scheduled for November 1945, anticipated roughly 250,000 American casualties in the first month. Operation Coronet, the assault on Honshu planned for March 1946, forecast even more. Japanese documents captured after surrender described Operation Ketsugo, a mobilization of virtually the entire population. 28 million civilians organized into units. Bamboo spears issued to women and children. Training for mass suicide attacks. A national resistance plan that contemplated 20 million Japanese deaths. Against that backdrop, the appalling cost of the bombing was compared, some said coldly, others said realistically, to costs that might have been even worse. The structural effects of the campaign were irreversible. The great Zaibatsu conglomerates had already wobbled under war strain. The fire shattered what remained of their vertically integrated webs. The dispersed system that once made Japan resilient to high-altitude bombs was exposed as fragile to fire and blockade. In the rubble, a different idea would one day take root. Post-war reconstruction forced a reimagining of production. Tighter coordination, leaner flows, inventories trimmed, suppliers synchronized. Out of places like Nagoya and Tokyo's remade wards, Toyota and others would pioneer just-in-time systems that changed the world manufacturing, an irony born from catastrophe. Innovation ran in parallel. Pathfinders rode radar beams through cloud and darkness. Incendiary chemistry became brutally effective. Operations researchers turned missions into solvable problems of spacing, pattern, and wind. Command and control nets stretched across thousands of miles to steer hundreds of aircraft against single targets with a consistency once thought impossible. Electronic warfare units jammed search radars and disrupted communications. Every strand of modern air power, from navigation to jamming to scheduling, traced lines back to these nights. There was a transformation of spirit as well. The idea of Yamato Damashi, the unbroken will of Japan, met a foe that careened over it nightly. The wind that once had scattered Mongol fleets had no answer for aircraft arriving from islands 1,500 miles away. A tradition that sanctified death before dishonor could not turn back flames. In 5 months, a nation that had conquered most of East Asia saw the material basis of that ambition reduced to cinders. Not every leader agreed on the causes of surrender when the war ended. Admiral Soemu Toyota argued that Soviet entry into the war mattered more than the atomic bombs. But his own staff reports from July 1945 undercut that position, noting plainly that the enemy's bombardment was rapidly achieving its aim of eliminating the homeland's capacity to continue fighting. The internal contradictions mirrored a national trauma too vast and too recent to name easily. The B-29's legacy extended into a new world. Strategic Air Command's nuclear doctrine arose directly from the hard-won lessons of the 21st Bomber Command. The conviction, sometimes right, sometimes ruinous, that air power alone could decide outcomes shaped Cold War strategy and later conflicts from Vietnam to Kosovo to Iraq and Afghanistan. The promise and the limitations of strategic bombing remained arguments we keep having because the questions refused to settle: how to fight, what to spare, what victory costs. Rebuilding Japan took time measured in hard years. The Korean War's demand jump-started factories. American occupation authorities who had overseen destruction guided reconstruction. By the mid-1960s, many of the very districts burned in 1945 thrummed again, this time with radios, cameras, and cars sold worldwide. Toyota City rose where Nagoya's industrial web had been cut. Electronics giants emerged from neighborhoods once reduced to ash. From near total ruin, the world's second-largest economy grew. As for the men who set the plan and measured its results, Curtis LeMay was promoted to lieutenant general 2 weeks after Japan yielded. He would later command Strategic Air Command from 1948 to 1957, crafting a nuclear strategy built on the same ruthless logic: calculate the targets, optimize the routes, deliver the payload that had guided March's fire. The phrase mutual assured destruction floated on currents that started in the Marianas. Robert McNamara, once the numbers man parsing bomb damage assessments, became Secretary of Defense in the Vietnam era. Reflecting in the documentary The Fog of War, 2003, he admitted the moral abyss the campaign opened. If the United States had lost, he believed, he and LeMay likely would have been tried as war criminals. He was not alone in feeling the ground sway beneath the numbers. The B-29s flew their last combat mission on August 14, 1945, striking the Nippon oil refinery at Tsuchizaki hours before Emperor Hirohito's voice went out over the radio to end the war. As the bombers droned home, the ceasefire order reached their radios, a quiet phrase closing a brutal arithmetic. Roughly 147,000 tons of bombs dropped, 66 cities hit, an economy dismantled. In Tokyo Bay, the battleship Nagato, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, rested on the harbor floor, sunk earlier by carrier planes, her great guns silent and useless against bombers that came from far beyond their range. The age of the battleship had passed. Strategic air power marked a new era. Japan's bamboo spears, bundled for a home defense that never happened, sit now behind museum glass. They tell a story without needing much text, a war that did not end with an invasion, but with the methodical elimination of capacity from the air. The B-29s did not merely burn cities. They proved a thesis, terrible, efficient, world-shaping, that in modern war, the side with superior technology, the industrial base to build it, and the system to use it decisively can unmake an enemy's ability to fight. From the ash of 66 Japanese cities, a new order took form, and from the new order came debates about power and ethics, victory and cost, that still live in every argument about how wars are fought, and at what price.